Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is Michigan Lakes and Streams Association's spring webinar series. I am Melissa DeSimone. I am MLSA's Executive Director, and I'd like to start by thanking the Glen Lake Association for generously sponsoring this webinar series. This session will be recorded, or it is being recorded, and we will likely have it available to you to view on our YouTube channel, pending some permissions. So that will likely happen. You will also be able to find a link to the recording at mymlsa.org, mymlsa.org. We are using a webinar feature today, so you are not on video, and your audio is also not on. And so you can sit back, and if you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box, and we will address those at the end of the session. If it's something I can answer ahead of time, I will go ahead and type you a response, but at the end of the session, we will take questions. Also, I would like to introduce our topic today. We have two speakers with us that are going to talk about different aspects of concentrated animal feeding operations. And we have Gail Philbin. She is the director of the Sierra Club, the Michigan chapter. And she has extensive experience in nonprofits for environment, the arts, social services in Illinois and Michigan. So she's got a wonderful history there. And then she will be followed also by Lynn Henning. And Lynn is with the Socially Responsible Agricultural Project. And she is also the winner of the 2010 Goldman Prize, which that's a great honor. So we're extremely happy to have both of these ladies with us today. And I want to thank them both for joining us. And without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, and Gail will get us started. And we're excited to hear you share your thoughts on this issue.
Thanks. I am attempting to share my screen here. Let's see. Oh boy. Sorry, folks. It's not showing me options to share my.
Okay, let me see if that's something on my end. It's possible. Hold on. It's also showing me some strange things I don't want to see.
It just shows an iPhone, and it shows your screen and my printer.
Oh.
But it doesn't show my the desktop where the PowerPoint is.
You mean you can see this screen with the people on it?
Yeah.
With you and I?
See your screen. That's one option.
If you click that, it will take you to your computer screen.
Ah, sorry.
No, that's okay. I understand. It's a confusing icon they give you.
Okay, so and then can you see my PowerPoint opening?
It's opening up.
Okay.
We are ready to go.
All right, let me just slideshow from the beginning. Okay. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for inviting me to speak about this really important topic. So can you see that thing across the?
I just see your slides.
Okay.
You're all set.
There's something popping up on my screen. I'm not sure why, but anyway. I'm Gail Philbin. I'm the director of the Michigan chapter of the Sierra Club, and it's really nice to see folks turn out for this serious webinar about a serious topic in the middle of a very serious period in our country. And I just appreciate your interest in this. It's a really important issue. Sierra Club's been working on it for about more than 2 decades. And I'm pleased to be presenting with Lynn Henning, who's a giant in the field of water testing and her knowledge of CAFOs. So I'll just start by giving a background, somewhat short background on, excuse my cat, I'm sorry, working from home. I'll give you a lay of the land in terms of how this a factory farm waste ends up in our lakes and streams, and then I'll toss it to Lynn, who will talk at length about what you can do about it in terms of local waterways and lakes and streams in your area. She's a pioneer, as I said, in water quality testing, so she'll be a valuable person for you to hear from. On the screen, you'll see I've selected a couple of photos. They show a common practice of factory farms, which is the application of waste on frozen and snow-covered ground. And this is a key manner in which animal waste ends up in our waterways. Basically, it shows you on the left side of this screen a picture of a tanker filled with manure that's spraying the waste on snow-covered ground. To the right is a picture of an example of a spill from that kind of application where it runs into a local creek because it's melting off with the snow. And I'll be talking at length about this throughout this presentation, and I'm going to be referring to it as snowfro rather than the application of waste on frozen and snow-covered ground, just because it's quicker, easier, and catchy. So anyway, let's get started. Uh-oh, it's not letting me share. It's not letting me move forward. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, folks. Many names for this type of facility: factory farm, industrial livestock operation, animal factories. The federal government refers to them as concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. And it's essentially an approach to raising farm animals that minimizes the cost and maximizes the production. Unfortunately, the result can be a large concentration of animals in a small area, generating too much waste for the land to safely absorb. And this can result in spills of the waste, leaks from pipelines or lagoons, and essentially runoff or the waste getting into the water and polluting it. And the reality is this factory farm system is unsustainable. It's subsidized heavily by taxpayer dollars. And essentially what happens is that the cost of doing business is outsourced to taxpayers. And it's at great expense to the environment, as we'll show you, and public health and the workers and the neighborhoods around them. What is a CAFO? Just brief history. The industrial approach to agriculture really took off after World War II. There was an excess of chemicals. Then we needed to find something to do with them, and they were applied to agriculture, and lots of good stuff started happening in terms of expanding production. And so by the 70s, we were really going into large-scale animal farming. The term animal feeding operation was coined in the Clean Water Act and identified as a potential pollutant, and permits were created. We call them NIFDs permits for short. It's the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NIFDs. So you're going to find a lot of acronyms on this. I'm sorry. It's otherwise it's a lot of words coming at you. So hopefully these are comfortable for you. So you have AFOs and CAFOs defined by the EPA in 1976. I've got the definition there. I don't need to reread it, but essentially it's about a concentration of animals in one area for a certain amount of time. A CAFO is essentially a CAFO is an AFO that meets certain number thresholds, so you can have large, medium, and small CAFOs. All large CAFOs need an agency permit that will govern how they handle their waste. Sometimes lesser sized AFOs can become CAFOs if they have clean water violations, and then they are medium and small CAFOs and need a permit as well. And this is a chart from the EPA's website. It gives you an example of the different thresholds for the different species in terms of when you have one of these facilities, when they get designated as a large CAFO. In Michigan, we have a lot of dairy CAFOs. And so, for instance, as you can see, a large dairy CAFO needs to have 700 or more mature dairy cattle. And we have CAFOs that are much bigger than that in Michigan, dairy CAFOs. And it goes down the list. We have some hog CAFOs increasingly in Michigan, and you can see the numbers there. We have quite a number of chicken CAFOs, egg laying operations, 125,000 or more animals for those. So that just gives you kind of a perspective of what's needed to be considered a large CAFO. This slide just kind of gives you a perspective of a picture, a snapshot of Michigan, essentially. There, at the time, in 2017, we released a report with a coalition called the Less is More Coalition, which was looking into how subsidies play into factory farm pollution in Michigan. And we released a report called A Watershed Moment that basically was a snapshot of CAFOs in Michigan and the violations that they had and amount of waste they generated, et cetera. And you can find it at that link there, or just go to Sierra Club Michigan's website. And we actually, that coalition produced 3 reports. But basically then, and these numbers have changed, but not so dramatically. There were 272 permitted CAFOs at the time, and that was out of about 17,000 livestock operations. So you can see that it's a small percentage of the actual operations, but they're generating a big amount of waste. And the other thing to know is that whereas in other states, a lot of these facilities are corporate owned, in Michigan, we actually have a large number of family owned facilities, but they're still large CAFOs. So sometimes the term family owned can be used to bring up the image of a small scale, like old style farm from the 20s. But in reality, you can be family owned and also be a large scale industrial operation. And this map just shows you the locations of the CAFOs in Michigan. So there's a concentration in the thumb, in the center of the lower peninsula, and in southern Michigan. We're finding that they're starting to migrate northward. My understanding is that's due to climate change and also a desire to find space where there aren't as many people. So that's a trend that we have been made aware of. This slide I just threw in because I wanted to just show how everything's connected in case people aren't already aware of it. I guess this group is probably a little more aware of this than other groups, but basically you should be concerned about CAFOs everywhere in the state because what happens everywhere is impacting the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes are connected and everything impacts everything else. So if there's a CAFO in northern Michigan, ultimately that watershed will drain into the, that water will drain into the Lake Huron, which will ultimately get into Lake Erie. So you don't have to be right next to a CAFO to have it impacting your water quality. And this is another map, courtesy of Bruce Washburn, who I believe is actually on this call. Hi, Bruce. And it shows the location of CAFOs, so those are the green triangles. And that is overlaid on a map of impaired watersheds in Michigan, which we have a considerable amount. So you can see that there are certain areas where there's, for instance, an E. coli watershed in the center of the state, and there are actually a lot of CAFOs in that area as well. And this was an issue that we addressed or tried to address in the recent negotiations, so to speak, whatever you call them, stakeholder process for the Michigan CAFO permit that was being renewed. Last year, there was a series of stakeholder meetings that we participated in, and this is the permit that governs how CAFOs handle waste for 5 years, and it went into effect in April of this year. And we tried to make the point that we need to have actual standards and testing and data to show that the factory farms in these impaired watersheds are actually not causing more harm by what they're doing. Some facts about CAFOs in Michigan. The famous or infamous Lake Erie toxic algae bloom in 2014 that poisoned Toledo's water and southern Michigan's was caused by, in a large part, industrial agriculture. There's other causes, but crop and livestock farming was the most significant factor in the growth of that algae. Saginaw Bay, Lake St. Clair, Lake Macatawa, they've all had toxic outbreaks similar to Toledo, the one that affected Toledo, but the positioning of those blooms in the water body was such that it didn't impact the intake. So that's why it didn't create as much of a stir as the Toledo incident. Lake Superior's had unprecedented algae blooms, and 80% of Lake Erie's annual water intake comes from the St. Clair River, which whatever's happening in Lake Huron and Lake Superior is essentially impacting because it's ending up in Lake Erie. So it's all connected, and we all need to be concerned about this. And you can see the aerial satellite view of an algae bloom in Lake Erie from 2017, I believe. So how is the waste getting into our waters? This picture depicts one way that water and waste combine. This is a milk house and shows it being flushed out. Fresh water or clean water is used to flush out the facilities, so they're getting combined with some of the wastes that are happening in the milk house. There's other ways water is used to liquefy the waste so that it can be applied on fields. But taking a step back from that, CAFOs actually essentially alter what is a natural cycle. In sustainable livestock management, you have appropriate numbers of animals for the land. The waste or the manure is being incorporated into the land as a natural fertilizer in such a way and in quantities where it stays on the land, and the nutrients are taken up by the crops, and it's a natural cycle and it continues throughout the year. CAFOs kind of short circuit that in that they turn what should be an asset, which is a manure, into a giant problem because it's just so much of it, and it has to be stored in facilities like lagoons. It has to be conveyed, and then things like digesters are created to deal with the waste. It just becomes a problem. Permitted facilities are supposed to have enough storage for waste throughout the year so that they don't have to do a snow throw application, but in reality, that doesn't always happen. And so we do see this application of waste on frozen and snow-covered ground happen annually. So it's essentially spraying waste liquefied manure on the ground, spreading it on top. It can be injected into the soil. The picture here shows you of a lagoon that has leaked. It's overflowing essentially, and it's making its way into the woods. So that would be one way that there's a creek in the woods, or a river that could be getting poisoned by some of this. There's also miles and miles of underground pipes in Michigan, lower Michigan especially, where in the mid-1800s they were laid, and then they've been continued to be laid to drain the lands so that they could be farmed. And those serve as a direct conduit for this waste. So if you're, there's wormholes and root holes that can serve as sort of preferential pathways for the waste to it's applied on the land, or if it's injected, it can make its way to the tiles. They call them tiles. They're underground pipes and they're perforated, but they're called tiles. And there's really no reason for this practice except to dump the waste. It's not an agronomic fertilizer situation because there's no crop to be fertilized in frozen or snow-covered ground. So it's really just dumping waste in the winter. So some of the qualities, the issues that we have are, a key one is water quality when it comes to factory farms. They consume a lot of clean water, as I said, for cleaning and liquefying. That the waste contains pathogens, antibiotics, heavy metals, chemicals. Lynn can talk more about what's in capo waste and what's getting into our waterways. But essentially you have this concentration of a huge amount of untreated waste. So human waste does need to be treated, but this waste does not. So for instance, a 3,500 cow dairy, which is not unusual here in Michigan, produces roughly the urine and feces equivalent of 70,000 humans. Or more simply, one cow produces the waste of 20 people. So that's a lot, and that's every day, and so that's why we see the problems that we see controlling this waste. When you apply it on land, there are limits to how many nutrients the soil can absorb, and this can lead to the runoff or leaching of dissolved phosphorus through those underground tiles that I mentioned and into waterways. And dissolved phosphorus in particular is a key driver of those toxic algae blooms. There's best management practices that factory farms use as a way of preventing runoff and keeping waste managed. And they're good for some things. And they use vegetation, buffers, constructed wetlands, all kinds of things. But unfortunately, those things do not stop dissolved nutrients from getting into the waterways. So it's a problem that hasn't been addressed as of yet in Michigan. There are public health impacts. Algal blooms, of course, as I mentioned, they're toxic. They contaminate the water and they impact animals and people. You can't swim when there's a toxic algae bloom near a beach. There's air quality issues with emissions coming from the animals in the barns. The spraying aerosolizes the waste and the application itself on fields. There's about 168 or more gases emitted from CAFO waste, and this is where Lynn really goes to town. She can tell you all about this, but ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, methane are some of them. So there's respiratory disease that occurs in homes and schools around CAFOs, as well as the workers themselves have problems. There's antibiotic resistance, which I know is people understand that as a problem more and more because there's been a lot of publicity about it. There's about 70 to 80% of the antibiotics used and sold and used in the United States are used for animals, not people. So there's a resistance that's built up when it gets into the food supply so that these aren't effective for treating human diseases. And they're used on the factory farms to keep the animals healthy and to promote growth in some cases. So they're used more routinely than they might be if you didn't have such close quarters and sort of breeding grounds for disease, and the animals aren't going outside and not getting sunlight and not eating their natural diets. So there's a lot of reasons why they can get sick in these conditions. So antibiotics are more needed in this kind of system. The carcasses are a byproduct of, certainly animals die on all farms, but in factory farms you get a lot more animals and you get a lot more dying happening, and so you can end up with piles of carcasses, such as in the photos that you see here. On the left, there's a red circle at the bottom of that photo, and that is then blown up on the right side, and that's a picture of a pile of dead cows. And you can see why that would be a big sign for animals to come like like to eat other dead animals, or thrive on that. So it can be a big problem. And then finally, more topically, pandemics are also associated with the industrial livestock system. Animal agriculture in the past has been linked to H1N1, the swine flu, and the highly pathogenic avian influenza a few years back. So it's not just animals in the wild being eaten that are the source, but in fact, the nature of these large-scale systems make them great breeding grounds for the spread of viruses. So that's something that we really need to take seriously. The economic and community impacts are also there. As I said, that the CAFO externalized costs, so the taxpayers are subsidizing doing business like building lagoons, the transportation of the waste, the biodigesters, which are being promoted more and more as a green solution to the waste problem. So they are getting they're getting subsidies for those things, and those things are expensive. And these are things that they get subsidies for that your small scale sustainable farmers are not even in need of. So they're kind of, the small scale folks are out of the loop of a big source of funding, whereas the CAFOs get those sources of funds because they need to do these practices to handle a large amount of waste that they generate. CAFOs can pollute local wells. There have been cases, and I think maybe it's the city of Blissfield, Lynn, you can correct me when you're speaking if I'm wrong, that had to actually build its own water treatment system because of poisoned wells around them. There's road repair that has to happen because you have these heavy trucks carrying manure along roads that weren't designed to hold that weight, so that's a burden on the local municipalities. Property values are lowered when one of these large-scale facilities comes to town because, the air quality is reduced and people don't want to be living next to these facilities. And they can gut local economies depending on how they operate, but there are certain CAFO systems where they're really top-down structures where large companies are controlling what the farmer does in all aspects of production. So the money is really just flowing out of the local community. It's not going back into the community in terms of purchases, etc. So the 2020 permit process, which I referenced earlier, started last year, and the Eagle agency was really good at including a lot of important stakeholders at the table, and we really appreciated the input that they let us give, and they took it seriously. It's clear that the staff at Eagle in the water department understand the problems associated with factory farms and how their pollution is endangering our water quality. We advocated for a bunch of improvements, and we did see some of them in the new permit, which was appreciated. One was or is a ban on the application of waste on frozen and snow-covered ground. So there finally is a snow throw ban in the CAFO permit, which went into effect April 1st for the next 5 years. We had advocated for it to be a complete ban without exceptions whenever there's a questionable freeze-thaw cycle in any month. So that could be November, that could be April, and with climate change, it's becoming increasingly, unpredictable. Unfortunately, they didn't ban it, a complete ban. January to March is a good start, but there are some loopholes that will make the permit ineffective in protecting water quality. One of those exceptions is to allow for snow throw application if there's an immediate injection of the waste into the soil, but this ignores the reality of all those underground pipes that I mentioned previously. So that essentially what you're doing is just targeting the waste more closely to the pipelines that will then take it out to the waterways. The permit also assumes that as long as the CAFO is in compliance with the permit and doing those best management practices I referenced, it means that if they're in impaired watershed, they are meeting automatically the standards for the loads of phosphorus and nitrogen and other the nutrients in that impaired watershed. And that's not a good assumption, as I mentioned, for dissolved nutrients, because those best management practices don't work for those. It also ignores the problem of digesters. And basically digesters do address the methane issue to some degree, that the methane emissions from the animals, and produce some form of energy, but they are still prone to the leaks and spills in the system. Plus there have been explosions at these digesters, so they're dangerous. And they don't remove the problem. The nutrients stay, and you still have a substance that has to be managed. And in fact, in 2018 in Berry County, it was, I forgot the name of the dairy. There was a dairy that applied, I've got it here somewhere, the Brookview Dairy applied anaerobic digester waste on land near Freeport, and there was a massive runoff into the Coldwater River. 5 to 10,000 gallons of waste was ended up in the waterways. So it happens, even if you have digesters. So Sierra Club has long supported a move away from our dependence on the industrial system to a more sustainable system that works with nature, works with in harmony with the environment, and leaves it for future generations. This means ending the subsidies that support polluting CAFO practices, and also makes the products cheaper in the marketplace, and essentially puts at the local sustainable farmers at a disadvantage. And we need better government policies that support this move. We need consumers taking more positive action to support those local farmers and opt out of the industrial food system. What you can do now, right now, first step is attending this webinar, which is great. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this. And you can keep learning. Sierra Club Michigan has a lot of information about CAFOs on its website. I would, if you're interested in the issue, definitely go to those pages and read all about it. Less is more, the coalition I referenced before, we posted their 3 reports on subsidies and factory farm pollution on our website, and you can look into those. And then Socially Responsible Agricultural Project, which is Lynn's organization, is a fantastic organization that helps communities that are impacted by factory farms in one way or another, whether they're just proposals moving into town or they have one that's causing problems. They are there to help. So, and they've got a lot of good information on their website, so they're worth checking out. You can email me if you have any questions after this webinar, and my email is there. In addition, I would just encourage everyone, if you can, to shop at farmers markets, join a community-supported agricultural project where you can get a subscription to the produce and the products on a local farm. Get to know your farmers, ask about their practices. It's amazing what you can find out if you just strike up a conversation. And the veil is quickly removed from what seems to be a small-scale sustainable practice. Sometimes it becomes clear that they're not really invested in that. And sometimes you find out that there's some great farmers right nearby. And you can actually find out if you go to localharvest.org and type in your zip code. That's a good way to start if you have no clue how to find out who's nearby, who you might be able to get the food from. So those are just a few quick tips, but really most effective, well, not the most effective, an incredibly important way for you can participate is to test your local waters. And I know the folks on this call are probably extra interested in that because of the name of your organization. And Lynn is just the person to tell you all about how you can find out what's in your waters and what to do about what you find out about. So I'm going to toss it to Lynn right now and let her take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Gail. I'm actually going to do a little administrative thing here. I'm going to stop